Well, hello, Fifth Avenue friends and family. My name is Terry Reed, and I am here with Pastor Melissa Skinner, and we are having another sacred conversation with Nicole Butler-Hooton. Hello, Nicole, welcome.
Hello, everyone.
And for some of you who don't know, Nicole is part of our Fifth Avenue family. She's actually one of our children's church leaders. I've had the privilege of serving under her, and I know how much she loves our kiddos. So we are very fortunate to have her. Nicole is also the recipient of Oregon's 2021 Teacher of the Year Award, which has been going on since 1955, I saw. So congratulations on that. That is wonderful. Nicole is a second grade teacher in the Bethel School District at Irving Elementary School, and she's been doing that for 14 years. Is it second grade?
Second grade, yep. And this will be when I finish in June. That'll be my 15th year. So I say 14 years, but I think I'm going to say 15 now.
Wonderful, wonderful. Um, so, so Nicole's husband is Matt. She's got a daughter who is 9 years old, and that's Avery, right? And then Beckett is 6, correct?
Almost. He's five
Almost
and three
6.
quarters. He'll say I'm
Oh,
5 3/4 now.
okay. Okay. And I read that you're also the representative for Oregon Indian Education Association.
Yes, I've been involved with that organization for 2 years now, and I still attended the events even when I wasn't part of the organization. I'm the Eugene Springfield area rep for Native and Indigenous people who come together to support education issues for all students, but really focused on American Indian students. And yeah, the initiatives are there and they're in place, and just providing a space for all of our students to learn and grow from. It's been a great organization to support.
Excellent. So, Nicole, thank you again for just bringing all that you are. I have so many questions with regards to educators in general when we talk about things like faith and race and culture that are so different. And we want to celebrate those things. That's why we're having these conversations. But personally, I feel like I am just starting this journey. It's been about a year. Pastor Melissa and I have been working together, and we have weekly conversations where we're chewing on stuff and we're learning and growing. But specifically with your culture and you being an educator, I know you're family focused, but what does that look like to you? And where do we go with our kids in this next generation, teaching them equity?
So I love teaching. I've known I wanted to be a teacher since I was a first grader. My mom said it's been, on the forefront. She's known I would be a teacher. So teaching is something that's a work of heart for me. And like you mentioned, Terry, excuse me, this is my 14th year I'm finishing up. And equity is on my mind as an Indigenous woman every single day that I walk into the classroom. And I think back to my first and second year of teaching and how different that was coming into a system that, I would say that I am trying to decolonize. I am trying to find space for my Native voice to be heard, and that looked different 12 years ago, and how it's progressed and really developed my sense of self and now my children's sense of self. And I've been able to really enrich the lives of so many youth and families by educating them on this work. If we want to call it equity work, we can call it equity work. But I did want to introduce myself a little bit more. Jayla Shaushi, Nicole Butler-Hooton. I am a member of the Confederated Tribes of Siletz and San Carlos Apache. So that's a very important part of who I am, and as I represent myself in our church. And I love volunteering, as you mentioned. I've been volunteering since, let's see, before I had Avery, so about 11 years. And I love just really nurturing the students and the kids that we have come through Fifth Avenue, and getting to know the families. It's been an amazing platform. And so thinking about the question that you asked with equity and how I do that in my own life and in my classroom, I think that it takes understanding that equity is not a program. It's not something that you adopt or you say, okay, now I'm ready. It's really a mindset and thinking about the spaces that we're in, right? We live in very colonized spaces. We live in a very white state, if you will. And so being an Indigenous woman means thinking of equity as a mindset and using that to create a classroom where all students feel heard and valued and respected. So, using my equity lens in my classroom, um, I'll ask myself this question: who does this decision or this curriculum or this lesson, who does it affect positively and who does it affect negatively? And maybe I'll ask myself a little bit further, depending on the lesson, the story, the unit, as I look through literature, who are the racial and ethnic groups who are affected? Who are the underserved groups affected? And what's the potential action of this lesson, or impact, I should say, of this lesson? So, kind of like asking yourself, who's in the room, who's been included in this work, and who's being left out of this work? And growing up in a very rural community, I didn't see people who looked like me. And I'm pretty fair skinned, comparatively. In the summer, I get dark, but hearing stories from my dad and my grandparents being one of the only Native families in rural Oregon, Reedsport, and just hearing stories about what it felt like for them versus me. I had teachers who did value my perspective. And I think that enabled me to provide a voice to my students now, my own children, so that they're proud of who they are. They're resilient. So I think the equity work starts with thinking about your culturally responsive lens as well. We all have this lens that we kind of navigate through our experiences, our relationships that we form. And so thinking about your culturally responsive lens, understanding, acknowledging your own bias. That's something that I do on a continuum in my classroom, and I would encourage others to do that. Thinking about the space, the physical space, but also the emotional and social space that we're creating. And then thinking about what structures exist in our systems, in our schools, in our churches, in our curriculum, what structures exist that can perpetuate inequities or aren't acknowledging experiences of others.
And
That was a really long answer.
I would love to jump in here because there are three things that I heard you say that I'd like to go back to. One, decolonization, decolonize. That's a word that I haven't heard before. I heard you use it on the phone a couple days ago, and I was really curious about that. So to decolonize, and I think that has to do with some of the systems that you're talking about. Also, you just touched on the fact that your parents and your grandparents, specifically your parents, had a different experience in school than you did. Can you share a little bit about decolonization and also the differences in your parents versus your experience?
Yeah, so decolonization to me is thinking about the relationships that we're nurturing, the space that we're creating, the word that we're hearing, and how we are continuing to live or operate in areas that perpetuate whiteness. And when you decolonize a space, you go in and you ask yourself, what are my bias? What are my relationships? How am I even just thinking about sin, right? We know that we're broken. We know that we're asking continually for our protector to come in and guide. And so I think about decolonizing to me as an Indigenous woman means looking at structures that exist and asking yourself questions, guiding principles, guiding questions about who's represented, right? Using that lens, who's represented, who's on our team, who's on our worship team, who's on our children's ministry team, who's on this team, who's on that team, and how are we appealing to them and where are we giving them space to share about their experiences? right? When I have families come into my classroom and the first thing I do is I get to know them, I do a culture unit. I want to know them. And I know Tim often will say this at church, we want to know you. He's begging, please come show up in these spaces. So I feel like our church is definitely on the right path to exploring decolonization, if we want to call that, if we, that's the term I use. That's the term I feel comfortable with, breaking down some barriers that we have control over, that we can be change makers. But I think asking yourself these questions when you go into these systems, and then giving people space. So with my classroom, I love to do this culture unit. I love to get to know my families, and we'll start the year like that. It's not one lesson, it's not two, it's a month of really seeing what my families bring to the table and how I can nurture these relationships and how I can get to know them on a more personal basis, so that they feel connected, they feel part of the curriculum, they feel represented. And so this year, I know I had one Native student. I wouldn't have known that just looking at her physically. She's part of the Wiat tribe, which is Northern California. They're rebuilding. They were all forcibly removed. They don't have, they're rebuilding their government, they're rebuilding their whole infrastructure of their reservation. So I've got to know this little girl again, who I wouldn't have known had I not asked them. Um, we have some Middle Eastern families, getting to know their traditions, their values, their keepsakes, their language. So I think that part of this work that we're doing, this culture work, goes back to getting to know the people who you're in front of, who you're sharing space with, and understanding that this is not easy work, excuse me. You're going to sit in discomfort. You're going to have questions, being vulnerable. I always say when I lead trainings that I never expect somebody to be the expert. I'm not an expert on my own culture of Siletz, of Apache. I sometimes wish I knew more and had more eloquent words to speak about equity and the continuum that I'm on as well. But I don't expect people to be experts. I think sitting in discomfort, you can realize that this is a roadmap of our work together that really starts with a focus on equity, building strong relationships, and then your next step. So if it's a church structure, if it's a school structure, whatever that is, like for me, it's meaningful instruction. It's creating relationships that don't just have and exist in our four walls, but that I'm a part of this child's educational process. And I want to know how they're doing in third grade. And I want to know how they're doing in middle school. And I want a graduation invitation. I want to know, I want my parents and families to know that they're valued, their culture is respected. And it takes work, it takes time, it takes learning, it takes listening, and it takes being uncomfortable sometimes.
I thought one way to look at the word decolonize is to look at the opposite, which is the idea of colonization. And when I think of that word, I think of just on the most basic sense, it is when people colonized this continent, it was basically by white people for white people, so anyone else was just the collateral or the cost that, like, maybe we try and treat them as best as can, maybe, but mostly for the benefit and the progression and success of the white cause. And so, although not like we're saying it's bad to be white, but the idea of colonization is the perpetuation and, like, how can we centralize whiteness and keep it superior and on top and have anything else be the cost and for our benefit. So decolonization would be saying, hey, it's maybe there were people here that said by white people for white people, but we're no longer going to agree with that and support that wherever we find that we're doing that.
Yeah, and being aware, and something that I start my trainings with, I've been asked to do multiple trainings, is we start with a land acknowledgement. It's it's something that I could take an hour on. I don't feel the need to do that in most spaces, and so it's something where we look at a map, because most of my trainings have been in Oregon. So we'll look at our seated and Aboriginal maps of Oregon, and we'll take a minute to just acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land, and that can go very far. And thinking about just sharing stories. I mean, again, I'm Indigenous, so that's close to my heart, but thinking about the people's relationship to place, the people's perseverance through their culture is part of that decolonization. It's getting to think about land in a different way. And sometimes that can be that very first step in acknowledgement moving forward.
Mhm.
I think also looking at, this is a hot button term right now, anti-oppressive pedagogies.
Mm.
So that's a mouthful. That's for teachers, that's for educators most often, and thinking about the way that you deliver, the way that you have your lens to look at curriculum, books, materials, um, names that are represented in math problems. You know, there's a whole rhyme and reason to this, but thinking about having a lens that's anti-oppressive and thinking about developing these pedagogies that help you navigate this system where there is a lot of whiteness that's created, that's been here, and amplifying our voices of marginalized populations, which I'm in that marginalized population. So yeah, so thinking about that um, thought.
Mhm. So that makes me think about, as we read through the Bible, oftentimes people will make comments about seeing ourselves in the story, right? I see myself in the story, and we identify with a person or a group. And Nicole, I know that you have shared that when you are introducing a concept or telling a story, you are painting a picture oftentimes of those representative in your classroom, right? So that everybody feels like they're part of the story. And it's interesting that you bring up math problems and even names, because if it's very English names or white names, then that tells a total different story. And to a child, it might mean, do I belong? Where am I at? How do I fit in the world? So I think that's a really good point. And also, as you know, as adults and Christ followers, where do we find ourselves, and where do we see ourselves in stories that have oppression? You know, where are we? Are we the Egyptians? Are we Pharaoh? Are we always the children of Israel? You know, how do we see ourselves? Because sometimes we are not who we think we are in the story.
Yeah, the power of a single story is goes beyond and goes into the work of the Bible. And I was just watching this podcast the other day of the power of a single story. And have you seen that on the TED Talk?
No.
Okay, well, I'll have to link it for you, and maybe we can share that with viewers. But it does talk about representation, and it does talk about how important that is in the relationships that we foster in our work in Christ. And we know that to center equity around things is God's word. And I'm no better than anybody else in this platform. And when I start to go down that, right, that's the pride. And that's not what the equity work is about. I strongly believe that. So I also think culture, right? I shared this with Terry a little bit, but it's something that, again, is really important as we have these conversations, is understanding the space that our members of our church are taking up and thinking about the levels of culture. And I was sharing with Terry a few years ago, we read a book called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. And we wanted educators to look closely at these levels of, I'm looking at it so I can kind of see, but these levels of culture where if you picture a tree with leaves and you have your surface culture above, those are your leaves, those are the clothes that people wear, the food that people eat, the stories that they tell. Those are the easiest to see and sometimes the easiest to change. And then the trunk is kind of that shallow culture. Those are harder to recognize, slow to change over long periods. Tempo of work, concepts of time, theories of wellness and disease, nonverbal communication, child rearing is in there. And then we have our deep culture, the hidden aspects of culture, sometimes that rarely change over lifetimes. And those are notions of fairness, definitions of family, group identity, kinship, how we view the world, our concepts of self. And it's what grounds the individual and nourishes their mental health. And so my work is that where I feel like we should focus more on is that deep culture, activating background knowledge, teaching on frames of reference that we know our students have, and bringing in the cultural richness of our neighbors, of our classmates, of our peers in our congregation, and making us stronger. So I can also share that visual. It's hard for me to explain it, but it is a nice visual.
I love that. And it sounds like those things that represent or that the leaves represent, it sounds like those are the ones that get the most attention because, and I think they could be the most polarizing because they'll be misrepresented. Where let's say if someone is feeling like all of this anti-racism and or like decolonization work is like, if they don't believe in that premise, it's usually because they're not aware of those roots, or they disagree with the definition of the roots. But so then they complain about the leaves and they'll say, now we can't say anything. Or like, oh, now if I wear my hair in cornrows, I'm appropriating something. You don't own cornrows. Like it's just the leaves, and they don't understand why this, like you call them microaggressions. So it sounds like they're small, but it's like these things only hurt because of the truths below them. It's not like anyone would really feel hurt if someone wore their hair similar to someone else. It's about the if that was the only picture, but it's because of the things that go beneath. It's because maybe we've had a history of keeping a culture down, or having had a history of stealing things from their culture and calling them our own. And I think that tree picture makes a lot of sense, and I would love it if you sent that to us.
Yeah, and I think it is. It's the impact on trust. It's thinking about your sense of self, what you've seen, and I think it is. It's the frame of reference. Yeah, I don't know a better way to say that, but yeah, no, I think that that's part of this social justice work, is understanding how the culture of my neighbor, the culture of my friend, the culture of my colleague, the person who's listening to the sermon, how their culture can affect their experience, and how it can provide sometimes a more limited view on the equity lens that we're trying to continue to build and grow with.
Well, I'm so encouraged because educators like yourself who are teaching kids about the the deep things, the deeper things than maybe I learned when I was in school about differences, beautiful differences among people, differences that should be celebrated. And I'm wondering with your teaching, when you come across curriculum, and I'm assuming that you have, but maybe not, you can speak to this. When you come across curriculum that may be a little antiquated, maybe outdated, or maybe foster some misinformation, how do you, as an educator, either bring that to light? How do you modify it? What's your process with that?
So if I'm thinking about, there's a document that I use sometimes that's like on teaching tolerance. There's standards, right, that are in place for multicultural curriculum or multicultural lens. How are we challenging the colonial relationships of power? And so I have this document that I use for Native American studies, which is called the Critical Orientations for Indigenous Studies. So it talks about place, presence, perspectives, political nationhood, power, and partnerships. So thinking about that just with some Native curriculum, thinking about, does this have stereotypes that may have the erasure of Indigenous people? Are these myths of disappearance? And thinking about a call for educators to use a lens that or use tools that are out there that we know teachers have access to, where you can look more closely at curriculum, and then kind of going back to that equity lens, who's represented, who's misrepresented, whose voice is missing. My second year of teaching, I had this poster, and I don't know where it is now, and I need it back, but it's like, it's a poster of that just says, whose voice is at the table, whose voice is missing here. And so it's bringing other people along, not just for them to be the expert, but to really value their input and then to provide these multiple perspectives of, if it's history, if it's lesson planning, if it's social emotional learning, right? That's our big push now as we return to in person, is this social emotional learning. And so I think continuing to challenge the colonial relations of power is something that's on my heart all the time when I look at curriculum, when I use a lens, when I hear somebody else using something that maybe I'm like, okay, yes, that could work. Let's see if there's something more relevant. Let's see if there's something more available that is representative, maybe your classroom content of students or your community of learners. Thinking about how to move forward in the work is really thinking about who's creating space, who are you creating space for, who's not represented, how do we include the representation without making them feel like the token person at the table. I mean, that's always this like circle. But I'm really excited at the work that we're doing around race relations, because in order to understand and grow with a population, with a community at church, it's really important to think about directives moving forward, truthful directives, recognition, providing a space that is building partnerships with your community and elevating the voice of people who may be underrepresented in our communities, which we know are brown and black people. So if we want to be real, then we need to have representation from these communities, and we need to be open and willing to be vulnerable and continue to ask the hard questions and love one another.
I just wanted to reflect, if I could, on a transition that I have made, which was that I was brought up in the 80s and 90s. And so it was, I think, a transitioning point where people were starting to say representation matters, and let's get like more diverse faces in each commercial, you know, those little decisions, or the math problems need to have more than just white people's names. And actually the chatter that I grew up with around that topic was like, why are they trying to make this into a thing? You know, like, why are they trying to, like, it's an agenda, as if like I'm a white person, we are being pushed out, we are being marginalized. Like they're trying to make it like it's about them. And the transition that I see it as now is that actually we as white people had been making it all about us, you know, where instead of thinking of it as, why are they trying to take what's normal? Like, it's not neutral to allow things to remain completely white dominated. You know, it's not neutral. It's just more like, it's just that there are more white people, but that doesn't make it neutral to let the narrative be the normal person is white, and then there are special people who are more colors, you know. And so taking whiteness out of neutrality for me is the hugest part, where yeah, like making sure there's more names. It's not like, oh, we're gonna make sure there are names in a math problem and that'll solve everything. And also like that's a big deal. It is a big deal, but it's not I'm probably just stumbling over my words, but it is a big deal because we were making it look like white was the norm, and that we were specifically highlighting white people as this is the average and the neutral. And the pushback would really mean that you would say that anything other than white would be pushing it in a weird agenda, where it's actually an agenda to try and keep things white. I mean, I don't know if I'm describing that well, but that's the course shift that I took, that now I don't feel weird at all about decentralizing whiteness. And I feel like it's much more accurate to do that.
And I think that what you're describing too, Melissa, really does speak to the fact that we consider there's an us and then an other in so many different areas. And we don't recognize it all the time, but even my own speech, I use myself as an example because I have been ignorant for a long time. I still have a lot of ignorance, and I know some people feel very uncomfortable hearing that and also talking about that. But I feel more confident talking about my ignorance, if that makes any sense, because I just feel like I have a long way to go. I believe that I do, but I believe it's important work to identify those areas where we have biases that or blind spots, more often blind spots that we're really not aware of. And Nicole, specifically, you talking about in your classroom, is there an exercise or something that you do even in the classroom with kids to recognize these blind spots that, in a fun but practical way to say, hey, we have them, and to be aware of those things that we don't always see about ourselves?
I think something that I love to do is to bring in mentor text. So I'm always looking for books that highlight um, all walks, I just love books. I love children's books. I love learning and growing with the students. And so I think for me, it's using mentor text. It's using books that really provide a framework that I know and I do have like our district has, it's not necessarily a rubric, but it's kind of like that where you have a few questions that you ask yourself with your equity lens. And so I use children's literature. I'm often bringing in guest speakers. I was teaching about Black Lives Matter, and I'm like, well, we have one Black educator in our school, and we have a couple, me as one of them, teachers of color. And so I'm like, okay, well, I want to teach about Black Lives Matter. This is an important topic. This is important for my students. I have 2 African American students, but more importantly, it's more important for my students who are not identifying as African American or student of color. So I had a contact, and I reached out and I told him a little bit about, what I'm doing. And he came in and he just blew my socks off. The kids were so engaged, and they didn't know necessarily that they were learning about Black Lives Matter. Like, it wasn't like, we're learning about Black Lives Matter today, and this is what that means. But he was representing the Black community, and he was providing an authentic voice.
Mm-hmm.
And providing that authentic voice is so meaningful, and it goes so far. And he would ask the kids, like, how many of you in the 2nd grade, how many of you have seen a man like me in your school? Nope, 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 nobody. And then how many of you have seen me, a person that looks like me on TV or out in the community? And sometimes you might see a person that looks like me, and maybe they're the bad guy in the film, or maybe they're the one that's sad in the book, or, so I want to tell you a little bit about me and my school. And he teaches 2nd grade in Texas. And so again, the kids are learning through these authentic representation of what it looks like to have a culturally responsive lens. And so you can do that through guest speakers. You can do that through sifting through your own curriculum, your own thoughts, and having sort of a framework on how to operate. And that's why Zaretta Hammond's work was really valuable to me and my staff, because it allowed us to think about our experiences and how moving forward, we're not limited by them anymore. So, so I think guest speakers, mentor texts, books, rubrics, learning constantly, always asking questions, partnering with people who I know are doing the work and who are excited to do the work and who are available to be their authentic self and to bring something to the table that creates space for maybe a different perspective from me. I mean, I just can't say that enough about the multiple perspectives. I think whenever I call it an equity stance. So when I started teaching, I didn't even know it was called an equity stance, but that's what I call it. And I have an equity stance that talks about who I am. I'm a believer, I'm a teacher, I'm a runner, I'm a mother, I'm a wife. And then it talks about what I believe. And this is in regards to my educational platform, but you could have a personal equity stance, you could have a private equity stance. So it's I am, and there's, things underneath there that I am, that I identify. There's I believe, and then I have a list. And then there's the things that I'm committed to do. I will overcome my past and current traumas. I will be intentional with building relationships with my family. I will have hard conversations. So thinking about your equity stance, if you will, that's a good place to sometimes start when you're doing this work.
Excellent. It sounds like a mission or vision statement, but very personal to who you are, what you believe, how you will treat others, how you'll treat yourself, how you'll do the work, right?
Yes, yes, creating families, building intention in your work, um, social justice as a platform. Yeah, all of those things could be represented in your mission statement or your equity stance.
So we are just have a couple minutes left, but I wanted to offer um, as kind of a last thought, and I hope that we have more opportunity to have conversations with you, Nicole, because you bring so much. I feel like we're really, really scratching the surface, as we oftentimes do. But in your wisdom and in your opinion, what are one or two things that we can do as a church to point to Christ? Just next steps to be the light, to be the salt, to create an environment where people can see themselves in the room or at the table and in the story. What would you offer?
Wow, that's a heavy lift. Showing up, being present, having the tough conversations, knowing that you're not alone, right? This work, this equity work, if you try to do it alone, I mean, I'll just bluntly, it won't work, right? It just, you're going to be isolated. You're going to be on an iceberg. It's something that is continual, it's forward moving. If I'm thinking about teaching, even in church, even in our lessons with the littles, great teaching is about so much more than education. It's really this continual fight for social justice so that we know that we're valuing the people that are in our presence, that are with us, and that comes through time and work and being present and showing up and getting to know the people who are occupying space near you, with you. And I would encourage everyone to think about their equity lens when they have their routines in place. They have their literature that they read, they have their core group that they're with. I think it is important to think about who's represented, who's underrepresented, and continuing to build a more culturally responsive lens starts with um, doing the work, reading your Bible, thinking about collaboration and ongoing learning. You don't have to be on your own when you do this work, and knowing you're not the expert, and we don't expect you to be, but yeah, it's a start. And I think having the conversation sometimes and giving people time to reflect can lead to very organic, authentic experiences that we can work through together and help guide each other through this. That's what we're here for.
And lastly, I have to ask this one more thing. You had mentioned something about the great protector at the beginning. Are there names of God that are culturally just they're just near and dear to your heart when you think of your own culture and your own experience?
So for me, I pray to God. I use God. My family does, but I have relatives who pray to Creator, and we talk about creation stories, and we talk about Creator a little bit differently, but very similarly in the same. But yeah, Creator.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I had to ask you that. I thought if I don't do it, I'm going to kick myself. So
No,
thank
and
you so much.
I love all the questions. I appreciate the platform. I appreciate all that you're doing because I think it's important work for every entity. I think churches, it's very crucial. It's like education. It's if we're not doing it, why?
Yeah.
And do you have anything to take us out with, Melissa?
I had something and then I forgot. So I do remember one thing, which is I'm speaking as a white person who's experienced the world in a white family and with a white identity. Um, I just, I can't help but keep getting more excited, even though we're dealing with actually sad things and hard things. Like people have been marginalized, they've been traumatized, there's been hard things. But fighting against those things for me, and trying to share the limelight and share what the center, I think when white people, when they tend toward feeling like something is being taken from them, I just want to push back and say, we are gaining so much. The reason why I'm excited and I'm still passionate after I've been on this journey for a couple of years, the reason why I'm so passionate is because I just feel like, even selfishly, I'm just gaining. I'm only gaining when I share the space, when I share what I define as central or what I define as who matters. It's not losing anything. It's only gaining brothers and sisters. It's gaining perspective. I'm gaining more of God the more that I include like people who look at God from different angles and different experiences, and people who have been healed from different traumas than I have. I'm only gaining here. And I just want to share the encouragement. And especially if you get that prick inside where it's like, oh, I don't want to, like, they're making it about them and I'm trying to make it about nobody or everybody. But no, if you feel a prick, that means you're making it about you. And I invite you to receive from others and give of yourself and share the space and take a step back and listen to others. It's all part of it, and it's all gains from here. And so that's my encouragement.
Good
And I
word.
just have to add just a bit. I'm taking and it's called an Empowerment Academy through the Oregon Education Association. And we're talking a lot about what you just said. Sorry, that's my dog. He's got a collapsed trachea, so he coughs. But we're talking about the human-centered design principles. And if to be human-centered means that you prioritize the perspectives and experiences of other people, of people who are similar to yourself and people that you're designing a curriculum for, a lesson, a sermon, an activity, a small group. And so I think what I hear you saying is human-centered means looking at diverse experiences and moving forward with a commitment to those values.
I love it.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for sharing of yourself and sharing of your the experience you've gathered just from talking to other people too. And I feel so much richer, and I'm so thankful.
Me too.
Thank you both for having me. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. All right. Bye.